So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Michelle, and I work here at the New Canadian Centre. We're really happy to have you here today for this discussion panel, which is hosted by the Peterborough Immigration Partnership in collaboration with 9 Ships 1825. So we are gathered here today on the Treaty 20 Michi-Saagiig territory, and in the traditional territory of the Michi-Saagiig and Chippewa Nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations, which include Curve Lake, Hiawatha, Alderville, Scugog Island, Rama, Beau Soleil, and Georgina Island First Nations. We are grateful to the Williams Treaty First Nations as the stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters. Historical and contemporary immigration to Canada are situated within a broader context of settler colonialism. Many of us, or our ancestors, immigrated or were resettled in Canada due to the effects of colonization. And yet, we must also grapple with the complexities of holding multiple identities, including as uninvited guests on stolen land or unceded territories. We recognize that the Indigenous experience is a vital part of the story and must be part of a critical and ongoing conversation. And while today's discussion will focus on the government and community support in immigration and will not directly address the impacts of immigration on Indigenous communities, we like to share that there will be a focus and intentional space for that important dialogue, which is happening on August 22nd, and it's hosted by 9 Ships. And I don't have the clicker, but Andy, if you could go to the next slide.
It's the 5th, Michelle.
Oh, August 5th, okay.
Yep, August 5th. Tuesday, will that work?
There we go. Okay, so ignore the information I have on this slide, and please go to the 9 Ships website where there will be more updated information. The panel is called Transatlantic Colonization and Consequence, Impacts of the 1825 Peter Robinson Emigration. It will be held at Bicentennial Hall at Trail College. That panel will explore the impact of the Peter Robinson settlement on both First Nations and Irish communities, featuring research and perspectives from Jack Hogarth, Professor Jack Hogarth, Dr. Laura Peers, and Dr. Mark McGowan, and moderated by Dr. Michael Eamon. So we encourage everyone to attend that important conversation and to continue reflecting on your relationship to the land, to Indigenous peoples, and to each other in this community, both in the past and present. We'd also like to share that at NCC, we also aim to raise awareness of truth and reconciliation by supporting newcomers to learn about the history of Indigenous peoples in Canada, including, for example, through our Lessons from the Land programming that happens on July 1st. So we commit to this ongoing work with our clients, our partners, and community members to foster an understanding and reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, and to work on meaningful action towards equity for Indigenous peoples. So with that said, today's panel is part of the 9 Ships 1825 Bicentennial celebrations, which commemorates the 200th anniversary of the government-sponsored emigration of nearly 2,000 Irish settlers to this region. I'm very pleased to welcome our 4 panelists today, who will explore how government and community support has influenced immigration success in Peterborough and other small and mid-sized centers, both in the past and today, and also what is needed for future strategies that help newcomers and communities thrive together. Because as the chair of the 9 Ships board, Brendan, states, immigration remains a vital part of Canada's development as a diverse, prosperous, and creative nation. So now I will briefly introduce the speakers and finally pass it on to Dennis because we have a full-packed itinerary today. So Dennis Carter-Edwards is a retired Parks Canada historian and director on the 9 Ships 1825 board with deep knowledge of the region's migration history. He has also served on local and provincial organizations, including the City of Peterborough's Arts, Culture, and Heritage Advisory Committee, the Peterborough Historical Society, Community Heritage Ontario, and the Ontario Historical Society. And then we have Abigayle, who is a 4th-year history student at Trent University and aspiring high school teacher with deep personal and academic interests in the Peter Robinson Emigration. I'll let her share more about that in her presentation, but first we'd like to thank her and her partner Lily, who did their research and did a comparative report for us with the help of the Trent Community-Based Research Center and with the supervision of the professor, Dr. Dummett. And we have Andy, who is our Executive Director of the New Canadian Centre. He has extensive experience building welcoming communities here in Peterborough and has been our fearless leader for the last 6 years and has been involved with the NCC in different capacities for even longer before that. He also has a personal interest in immigration issues as his master's thesis was focused on immigration policy. And last but not least, joining us remotely is Melissa Kelly, and if we can go back to the Zoom, there's lots of navigating today. Melissa, if you'd like to turn on your camera, there she is. Melissa is a senior research associate at Toronto Metropolitan University, who is leading international research on immigration to smaller cities in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Melissa has contributed extensively to the development of labour market and immigration policies and programs for the Government of Canada, and her work has appeared in many peer-reviewed journals. And fun fact, she's also my former colleague at TMU, so happy to see her again. So today, each panelist will have about 15 minutes to present, and after all the presentations, we'll have a bit of a Q&A session. So thank you again for being here, and thanks to Yvonne at the back there for helping with all the setup today. Again, light refreshments are available at the back. Now I'll pass the mic to Dennis. Please enjoy.
Okay.
Or you have one. Okay, perfect.
Testing.
There, that looks better. Okay, everyone can hear me? We wanted to take this opportunity to explore beyond just the Peter Robinson story to the wider issues of immigration that I think in many ways are reflected in the story of the Irish, but go way beyond that. So thank you for that opportunity. Before I start also, I wanted to know how many people in the audience have Irish background? Wow, okay, no surprise there for sure. So what I'd like to do in my brief presentation is to look at some of the issues around the Robinson migration and perhaps draw from there some broad themes, some issues, some challenges that apply to immigration through the decades and even into modern day. And I've tried to break it down into categories that can help us look at what the Irish experienced in 1825 and what lessons we draw from those experiences today. Starting off, to understand immigration, I think you need the context. Immigration is hard. It's not something people often willingly do. You leave for a variety of reasons, not all of them for the best. And that was the case for the Irish in Southern Ireland in the Cork area in the 1820s. In this area around the Blackwater River area, around Mitchelstown, north in the Cork area, there were isolated examples of crop failure, potato crop failure. Not the universal failure from the 1840s, but very isolated, but certainly an indication what was coming. In addition to the crop failures, there was a movement by the large landowners to consolidate their holdings. So Irish farmers with small tenant holdings of an acre or 2 acres or less was inefficient, and they were determined to move the farmers, their tenants, off the land, consolidate those holdings for larger, more efficient farming. So what you had is crop failure, land dispossession, and that created an environment for protest, for isolated violence, for community justice on some of the managers who were forcing people off the land when the tenants, when the leases were cancelled. The result was the British government reacted by sending in the army, imposing martial law, created a very tense environment in and around the Blackwater River area in Southern Cork. So, how to deal with this problem of many mouths and perhaps not enough food to feed them. And the government responded with the next slide. I get this right. With this gentleman, Sir Wilmot Horton, who was Under Secretary of State for the colonies, convinced his colleagues in the British government to sponsor an immigration scheme that would take some of these Irish tenant farmers from Southern Cork and move them to the colonies. And to make it attractive, the government fully supported this project with free passage, medical care on board the ship, land, cabin, tools, food, rations, the whole 9 yards to get them established. So that's a pretty big commitment. The government committed £35,000 in 1825 for this project. So that shows a significant commitment. And as you can see, already we've got a couple of key themes that are emerging. One is the context in which immigration takes place, both historically in the case of the Irish in 1825, but think through the 20th century and the 21st century, whether it's problems that the Vietnamese boat people face, Syrian refugees are facing. What is the environment in which the immigrants are compelled to leave all they know in terms of their family, their community, all the things that give purpose and definition to our life, leave that behind and venture to a new world, new experience, and new challenges. So there's something there from what the Irish were facing. It wasn't that it was a dire situation, but it was difficult. And I think for the families that made the choice to go, they were looking for a future for their children. They may have been able to manage, not so sure that their children would have the same opportunities. So I think there's one of the motivating factors that you want to look at when discussing immigration. Move on. As I mentioned, to make the immigration attractive for these successful settlers was to ensure sufficient support. And again, there's a common theme that applies even today. How do we guarantee success for immigrants coming from the New World? You need to make sure they have the support to get there. And to get there, what are the keys to success in integrating into the New World? In the case of the Irish, as I said, they were very fortunate. The government had room for about 300 families. In total, about 2,000 Irish were selected by Peter Robinson, put on board the ships that left Cove in May of 1825, sailed across the Atlantic, sailed down the St. Lawrence, arrived at Peterborough, ready to embark on a new and I'm sure at times daunting adventure. So, crossing over. Again, trying to place yourself back into the mindset of those families who took the government offer, one of the lucky ones, one of the lucky 307 odd families that were selected by Robinson for this experiment in immigration policy. They only had a couple of weeks to collect their belongings, to say their goodbyes to family and friends, and aunts and uncles and neighbors, gather at the harbor in Cove and board the ship. I try to put myself in the mindset. What was it like when you pack up a few little possessions you could carry with you, say goodbye to your relatives, probably knowing full well that would be the last time you would see them. In fact, when many of the families left, they held what was called an American wake, which is in fact a recognition that when those families got on board the ship, the family and the kin they left behind would probably never see them again. So quite a difficult situation to face, I'm sure, for those families. Excitement at what lay ahead, but certainly sorrow at what they were leaving behind. Another important aspect of immigration, applicable both then and today. How do we ensure that as the immigrants make their way across the Atlantic to settle in Canada, how do we ensure they get here with as much good health and resources to succeed? In the case of the Irish, they were placed on board 9 ships. Here's a pretty good image of what traveling in the 1820s looked like. It was not a 9-hour or a 6-hour flight across the Atlantic with a nice meal and a selection of a movie on the screen. This was 30 to 35 days in the hold of the ship with young children, many of whom were sick, perhaps the odd couple who may not have agreed that moving was such a good idea and had a bit of a disagreement throughout the 30 days that were there. I told you we shouldn't have come. You can just picture what went on. Plus the air, the smell, and the disease that was passing around. Very difficult conditions for them, and yet the British government did what they could to ensure they had proper medical care. So there was a surgeon on each ship. There was rations to make sure they had sufficient food, although it didn't quite agree with the diet that the Irish had been used to. So that was a hardship. And again, it's the idea of tradition and facing new environments. How do you combine your traditional foods and your traditional diet with what you're going to face in your new world? Certainly a challenge for the Irish. So the Irish arrived in the summer of 1825 at Quebec City after a 30-day voyage across the Atlantic. Finally put their feet on land. Well, the journey is not quite over. From Quebec to Montreal, up the Lachine Rapids, up the Long Sault Rapids on the St. Lawrence, camped at Kingston for almost 30 days while Robinson was making arrangements for land to be surveyed, supplies to be brought in, and all the infrastructure to make the migration from Quebec through St. Lawrence successful. So again, a challenge, and as we know from the historical records, which are an amazing archival resources, perhaps the best documented migration scheme that you will find for North America. And many of those records are held right here in Peterborough at the Peterborough Museum and Archives. And during the summer when we have people from Ireland coming over, I imagine that's going to be a hot spot. So the challenge of finally getting settled on the land, and then reality hits home. Here's what they faced. They got their 100 acres, but a virgin wilderness that had to be cleared, crops had to be put in, a cabin, and a new life begun. So a challenge for the Irish immigrants in 1825. And I think some of the themes that I've drawn out from there in terms of how do we ensure the tools, the resources, the means to be successful for the Irish, which worked out extremely well. Those families are here and they're prospering. But for today, different set of circumstances. Perhaps I can pass it on to my colleagues to explore some of those themes in a different context. So Abigayle, what do you?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out. I do want to recognize that the presentation I'll be giving today is partially the research that it's based off of. As Michelle was mentioning, was also done by my classmate Lily Prime. Unfortunately, she was not able to make it today, but I did want to recognize that she is just as responsible for this research paper as I was. It was a comparative report that we did through the university as a community-based research project in conjunction with the NCC. I was very lucky and happy to do this project. Our professor brought it up in class, and I have Irish heritage actually. My family came over in 1819, so this was a neat project to do to kind of get an idea of a different immigration of Irish people, but I'm always interested in their history. So this was an amazing opportunity for me, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So the project, we actually focused on the everyday experiences of the Irish immigrants, specifically the Peter Robinson Emigration, and then we compared that to experiences of immigrants today. We were able, luckily enough, to focus primarily on the Peterborough area, which we were not sure that we were going to be able to do, so that was really amazing. But yes, today I'll only be focusing on the Peter Robinson immigrants' experiences, because the other panelists will be covering current immigration issues, so I'm focusing on that area. So Dennis gave us the context for how they got to Peterborough, and he mentioned that when they got here, the stuff they had was not that developed. So when they first showed up, a lot of these cabins weren't actually built yet. They had to wait for them to be constructed. So they showed up to the Peterborough area, which they ended up calling at that time Scots Plains, and they had to build these structures out of poles and like tree branches, and they had to put mud over them. So they were very temporary structures that they built, that they were living in that summer. While these small cabins that Dennis had a picture up above, that's what they were waiting for. And it was usually experienced settlers, some people who were maybe already living in the area, who ended up building these cabins for these settlers that Peter Robinson had commissioned to be built. So these people were living in these huts on this plain for most of the summer. and waiting for their cabins to be built. Now, in Scott's Plain, they ended up also building some more permanent structures, which ended up being administration buildings and places for their resources to be stored. So that actually ended up being kind of around where Water and Charlotte Street is now. Those were the first permanent structures, and these were built by the immigrants. So they kind of pulled together and they built these more permanent structures. They also built, I think it's Hutchinson's house, also for their doctor. So they pulled together, they built that house. So it's kind of what their housing situation looked like. They had to do a lot of the clearing of the land themselves, so they had to have those skills, and they were doing that for themselves. So from a health perspective, they were pretty well provided for by the British Crown, and so they did have some medical professionals with them. However, disease was rampant when they came here. They came here in the summer. It was a pretty hot climate for them, and especially with all of the bugs, because it was wilderness. So you can imagine what the bugs would have been like. They had a lot of fever spreading and what they called ague. So even with the medical professionals, they still battled disease. So they ended up also building a hospital. And it ended up being referred to as Hospital Point. And the materials that were used in the hospital ended up being donated by members in the community. Anything they could spare ended up going to the hospital so that they could have a space to treat their sick. Now when they got to the Peterborough area, the British had provided them with rations and tools to start their new life. So they were given things to help them in their journey to develop their farms, etc. And the hope was that if they were given these tools, they could start and then they could end up developing the land well enough that they could pay back their debt, because these families also owed a debt of £60. So their hope was, we're going to give you these tools, we're going to give you some animals, you develop the land, and within some time you'll be able to pay us back. And hopefully the British were planning on seeing that as a source of trade and another source of resources that they could access. Transportation at the time was a challenge. Some historians have speculated that one of the reasons why this area was chosen was because our water systems here make it a lot easier to transport things. There was one road between Lake Ontario and Rice Lake that was not well developed, so Peter Robinson ended up having to, with the settlers' help, fix it. It took them about 10 days to get it to the point where they could actually transport their belongings by putting boats on wheels across. And once they actually got here, they had to put in a lot of work to develop road networks where they needed them when they couldn't use the waterways. So if they couldn't use the water, they had to develop the roads. So it was a challenge getting things around. However, our water networks are good enough here that they were able to transport the supplies for about, I think, half the time they were on the water, and it was what we found in our research. So it was a lot of boat work, and they put in a lot of work to utilize those as much as possible. And even into the 30s, they were using the water so much that they ended up starting the canal project eventually by the settlers who moved here, because that was their most successful way of getting things around. So what we can see here is that these immigrants, while they were given the tools by the government, the best that they could do to succeed, they still ended up having to pull together as a community. So they were given medical professionals, they still had to build that hospital. They were going to be provided cabins, but they still had to build huts to live in until those were done. They helped with the fixing of the roads, So they were really pulling together in the community to make sure they actually survived. You can see here that it's important to recognize the roles that government can play, but then also recognize the importance of building a community and those connections between people for things to actually succeed. Because if they hadn't pulled together, I think it would have been a vastly different story. So that's what we found in our research, is that community ended up being key for the success of the Peter Robinson Emigration project. So, yeah, thank you. I guess you can fill us in on the new immigration.
Fascinating. Look forward to hearing more as we get into the Q&A. I have Irish ancestry as well, so it's a personal interest on my mother's side. I have ancestors who came, I think, early to mid 1800s in the Ottawa area, Gatineau Valley, north of Ottawa. So thinking about today, I could go on and on, but I'll try to be brief and touch some points. But I wanted to just set the scene, because one thing I find is common is that people know that Canada is a nation of immigrants. We know that immigration is important for our country historically and now, but don't necessarily have a full understanding of what the immigration system is and what it looks like, the different pathways and what those pathways mean for people who are on them. So starting at a high level, just to lay the scene of how immigration works today. The federal government has what's called a multi-year immigration levels plan, which sets targets for different categories of immigration for new permanent residents. Many permanent residents eventually become citizens, but the targets are for how many new permanent residents will be admitted to the country each year. And there's a total number, which is currently around 400,000. The government was on track to drive that up to 500,000. As you might have heard in the news in the fall, they reversed course on that, and now we're heading towards a decrease, more towards 360,000. We'll see what happens with the new government and what direction that will head. But broadly, there's basically three categories. There's economic class immigration, there's family reunification, and there's refugee and humanitarian. So economic is just under 60% of new permanent residents. Family, which is essentially families of economic class immigrants, is another 24%. So you put those together, almost 85% of immigration to Canada in a given year are people who are selected and admitted to the country for the reason that they will benefit Canada economically and their family members. And then we have refugee and humanitarian. So refugees are about 58,000 a year that come in, or 15%, and then humanitarian is another 10% on top of that. Humanitarian, the distinction is basically that there's some immediate compelling need to let someone in, kind of separate from a standard refugee program. In addition to that, there's temporary residence. So, this also became a topic in the news over the last year and 18 months. And so there's a variety of categories of temporary residence as well. The biggest of those being international students and temporary foreign workers. And a component of temporary foreign workers, a large component, are international students who have kind of converted from student visas to temporary worker visas post-graduation. And you may be surprised to know that there's a lot more temporary residents than permanent residents in terms of number of permits given out in a year. There were over 700,000 new temporary residents last year, and the government is trying to drive that number downwards to about 550,000 over the coming years. And this is obviously having a huge impact, especially in terms of the student visas, on post-secondary institutions, but also on local businesses, in terms of that being a source of labor for a lot of businesses, especially in retail and service sector. And then obviously for those young folks themselves, especially those who had planned to come to Canada to study and had hoped to stay. And we could have an interesting conversation, which would be a tangent about whether we like, as an immigration policy, international studies as a pathway to permanent residence. But that is essentially what had been happening over the last 5 to 10 years, is that applying to come here as a student and then getting what's called a postgraduate work permit, becoming a temporary foreign worker after that, and then eventually applying to become an economic class new permanent resident. That was increasingly common pathway. It's pros and cons to that, but that is changing dramatically as a result of recent government policy changes. But that gives you a sense of the distribution, and I think the key point is that over 8% of new immigrants are here for economic reasons because they will contribute economically to Canada, which is to say, it is in our self-interest as established Canadians to get them here and allow them to be here. It's not about humanitarian or compassionate reasons or charity. It's actually very much self-interested government policy for economic and demographic reasons, which is relevant in terms of the conversation we'll have about government support and the rationale for that. A much smaller proportion are refugee and humanitarian class. And this, it's a totally different frame. It's not, hey, you said you want to come here and build your life in Canada and contribute economically. It's, hey, you can't go home to your country of origin because you're seeking refuge. You have been persecuted, you're fleeing war, you're facing persecution because of your personal identity, religious, sexuality, sexual orientation, that kind of thing, and you can't be in your country of origin. You're seeking refuge. And Canada, to our collective credit, as a matter of public policy, says, come here, find refuge. We don't say that to a lot of people. I would say in a global scale where there's almost 30 million refugees, not to mention many millions more displaced people, but for 60 to 70,000 people a year, we say, come to Canada, find refuge here, full stop, period, no expectations. In fact, we know that eventually those folks who do come as refugees do contribute economically, just like those folks who come here as economic immigrants. But the supports that those groups receive are quite different as well, on the basis of the reasons why they're here. And similarly, temporary residents receive quite different supports from permanent residents because, in theory, they're not supposed to stay, though we know many of them do. So, we continue to be a nation of immigrants on Indigenous lands, and that is, I would say, even more the case than it has been for many decades, going back to the early days of immigration in Canada, where there was obviously, by definition, a huge percentage of the population was born in a foreign country. That number has been steadily increasing in recent years. In the 2021 census, almost 1 in 4 people in Canada was actually born in another country. And almost 100% of our population growth is now from immigration. And as you look at the birth rate of the established Canadian-born population being low, kind of economic and demographic viability of our country is increasingly linked to immigration, and increasingly diverse immigration. It's not the majority coming from Western Europe like it was even 50, 100 years ago. So just to talk a bit more about the experiences of, so that's kind of the context of the immigration system, but to talk a bit more about the experiences of folks who come as newcomers, it's varied. Everyone's story is unique. We can make some generalizations based on kind of the policies and what's available, but I think one thing I've learned is that everyone's story is, and everyone's journey is truly unique. So it's actually quite difficult to make sweeping statements. That being said, I'm going to make some sweeping statements and generalizations. So for people who come as economic class permanent residents and their family members, they have access to government services like what the New Canadian Centre here provides. And now this is, again, an intentional public policy choice by the Canadian provincial municipal governments. And I would say looking at it globally, we're on one extreme of the spectrum where the other end would be countries that say, we don't want immigrants here, you're not allowed into our country, and if you get in, we're going to kick you out, so one extreme. Then there's other countries that say, you can come in, but we're not going to give you any kind of status, we're going to exploit your labor, and make sure you work on probably the most dangerous labor needs in our economy, and then you get hurt, or there's other reasons that we kind of make you go away and get kind of the next rotational labor force in countries. But that's kind of another approach, and then there's countries that say, you can come in, but we don't really want you here. We know we need you economically. We'll kind of keep you in a precarious status and force you to kind of change who you are and never kind of let you fully settle. A lot of European countries, I would say, have policies like that because they're particularly concerned about conserving their national heritage and identity. And then there's other countries that let folks in, have a pathway to status, but don't really provide support. So, you're here, you can stay, but pull yourself up by your bootstraps, good luck to you. Which is, more, say, like the United States, I think, is a good example of that. And then there's Canada, where we say, come, you have pathways to have permanent status. Your kids can go to school. You have employment rights. You can access public health care. And we're going to actually fund employment services. We're going to fund integration services to help you understand the school system so that your kids know how to get registered and the parents know what's going on. We're going to provide social and cultural activities. We're going to connect you with volunteers and tutors. You can tell I'm describing all of the services that the New Canadian Centre provides, for example. Because, again, selfishly, this whole economic immigration policy is very selfish, and that being that we want those folks to succeed as soon as they can, because we recognize that the sooner newcomers succeed, the sooner we all benefit. And so that, in general strokes, is the Canadian approach, and particularly for permanent residents, people who come as permanent residents. And, relatedly, for people who come through many refugee programs, they get permanent residence on arrival, which is relatively unique from a global perspective. They come, find refuge, and you have permanent resident status, which is, there's very few distinctions between a permanent resident and a citizen in terms of rights that people have. Now, of course, there's ways that things can improve, and there's, I think, important criticisms of the Canadian system and ways that it can be better. There's people who are here who are undocumented because our system is so darn complex and unaccommodating that they fall between the cracks, they lose their status, but they stay here because they have been on a plane, or somehow get themselves here, they cross the border at an irregular border crossing like we've read in the news, or they come as a visitor and then say, you know what, I'm a refugee, I'm staying. And that kicks off a protracted process where they have precarious immigration status. It takes years for their claim to get fully heard through the immigration tribunal system that we have in Canada. The majority of those, I believe it's over 80% of those refugee claimants, are ultimately assessed to be truly refugees and given permanent resident status. But again, that can take years, and in the meantime, they're in quite a precarious situation with minimal supports and challenges in terms of being able to work. So that's a lot of information. In terms of the experience, though, just a couple more things on the experience of immigrants today. That when people come to Canada as economic class immigrants, I would say, many of them succeed right away, and there's data to support that. Even as economic class immigrants, though, many still struggle with a variety of things, from cultural integration, probably not language, because by definition most economic immigrants have some strong ability in English or French. Sometimes their family members, though, who aren't the primary applicant, have those kind of challenges. A big challenge, though, that we see is credential recognition of foreign experience and credentials. And so this is something that is just a huge shame from any perspective. It's incredibly challenging for people who have capabilities who aren't able to put those to work in Canada. The drop in income, the not living up to the expectations of what they thought the immigration experience would be, the way that the social status and ability to contribute in their country of origin that they knew and lived. Maybe they were a doctor or a lawyer or a nurse, some sort of profession. They come here, they can't practice, and all of a sudden they're way down in the social rung. Feelings of self-worth, mental health starts to suffer. Not to mention the sheer practical difficulties of surviving on a lot less income, having to take a survival job. And we actually know from studies that as a whole, as a population, the physical health and well-being and mental health and well-being of newcomers declines after arriving. So we have a bit of a fantasy, I think, in the Canadian population that we say, oh wow, they're so lucky to come here, Canada's really great, they're going to just be so much better off, when in fact the data shows that newcomers are generally, this 85% of people who are in that economic class, highly skilled people come, and they actually have deteriorated quality of life for a number of years until they can land, start to settle and establish themselves successfully and kind of carry on from there. And in some cases, particularly for the refugee population, it's the next generation that really gets going and starting to succeed economically. There are a lot of costs with immigrating. It strikes me about some of the supports that the government provided. Newcomers, if they're economic class, it's very expensive to get through immigration processes, paying fees and getting documents, certified documents and medical checks and all of this stuff to come and immigrate. That's an expensive process, let alone flying yourself and your family to the country, which is on you, let alone the currency differences and your savings, your loss of gap in income while you're trying to make the whole immigration process happen. Then you land in this new country that you've just paid a huge amount of money in airfare to get to, and all of a sudden your savings aren't worth as much because the currency is different, and you're trying to start up your life here. And I'm not saying this from a, whoa, let's pity them, but the very real costs of starting up life in a new country that is not borne by the government. It's borne by those newcomers themselves. And now, of course, they benefit from all the things that anyone in Canada does, public education and access to public health care and all that kind of thing, but there's substantial costs associated with starting a new life in Canada that are borne by the immigrants themselves. For refugees, if you're one of the lucky 10 or 15,000 or so that come through the government-assisted refugee program, your living costs are covered for the first year, for 12 months, after which you're kind of on your own and move into the general social assistance system if you haven't been able to find employment in that length of time, which Frank knows about that, it's woefully inadequate. And even for those refugees who get that government support, they get what's called an immigration loan, where they have to pay back the cost of their airfare over time. It's an interest-free loan that they don't have to start repaying right away, but they do have to pay that back. And of course, if you're thinking refugee family with multiple kids, which many of them are, that could be airfare from far part of the world for 4 to 8 people. We're talking like thousands and thousands of dollars. It's a big piece of money to be repaying when you're trying to get established here. And just on one last point I wrote down, that point you made about it takes a community, and I think that is an important point, and it is still true today. We're fortunate as an organization here, and I described that Canadian approach to funding settlement organizations like the New Canadian Centre with public dollars. So there is that government support, but we also rely on community support, both financial contributions from donors, but substantially from volunteers. We have over 160 volunteers who help out in a variety of ways, and I think are an example of how it takes a community to actually create a positive and successful and hopefully relatively quick settlement process for newcomers to Canada. We'll pause there and pass it along to Melissa.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much for the invitation to participate in this wonderful event today. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but it's great to be part of this nevertheless. So special thanks to the organizers for putting this together, and also to the previous presenters for sharing such interesting insights. And actually, I think my presentation is going to build quite well on the presentations that we've already heard, so that's great. I'm going to focus today on the lived experiences of newcomer communities, so the on-the-ground realities they face, and how they've navigated the challenges of settling in smaller communities, many of which may not have a full range of settlement services that a city like Toronto, for example, might be able to offer. Much of my research in the last few years has focused on Northern Ontario, a region that in recent years has received a significant number of refugees, if we look at, for example, Thunder Bay, but also a number of migrants coming through other pathways. And one of the most notable has been international student migration due to the presence of several post-secondary institutions in Northern Ontario that have opened their doors to international students in recent years. Of course, immigration to Northern Ontario is not a new phenomenon. Like many parts of Canada, the region has seen successive waves of European settlers. French traders began arriving in significant numbers as early as the 17th century, followed by British, Irish, Nordic, Italian, and Eastern European migrants. many of whom came to secure employment in the resource-based industries of mining and forestry, which to this day continue to be dominant in Northern Ontario. Today, however, the newcomers arriving in the region are no longer primarily from Europe and instead come from a range of regions around the world: Africa, the Middle East, Brazil, Philippines, and India, to name just a few. So I really want to talk about what it's like for these newcomers coming to a smaller place, similar to Peterborough in some ways, and what they've experienced, given perhaps the lack of diversity in these communities, the lack of experience the communities may have with diversity, and also some of the challenges these communities face with providing services to incoming migrants. So I'll be sharing my findings based on 54 interviews carried out with newcomers from a variety of places, as well as extensive conversations and focus groups that I've carried out with stakeholders, including local employers, service providers, as well as other local residents and city representatives across the region. And I want to hone in on three things. So how newcomers are actually going about meeting their basic needs, how their cultural and community needs are being met, and finally, how they are contributing to and shaping the communities in which they are settling. So let's start with meeting basic needs. As with the Irish migrants who came before them, the first thing most newcomers think about when they arrive in a new place is really the basics, right? So how to put a roof over their head and how to find a job so they can feed their families. Now, as Andy mentioned, refugees are typically resettled in designated centers that are equipped to provide specialized support services, which means they often receive this basic assistance on arrival, and they may have less to think about in this regard. And these communities also often tend to mobilize around refugee arrivals in really, truly remarkable ways, and one could talk for a very long time about that. The fundraising efforts that some communities undergo, the informal support networks that they create, and the hands-on help that they provide refugees with the settlement process. The community response is truly inspiring and critical to successful integration. But increasingly, newcomers don't have access to these types of supports, and this is due to a policy shift, as Andy already outlined, which has veered more towards temporary migration. And in many cases, temporary migrants are not eligible for at least federally funded settlement supports. So it's really up to them to kind of figure things out. And international students are a prime example of this. They arrive in a small community and they have to make things work for themselves. And indeed, many have struggled a lot, I can say based on my research, to find housing, to cover their living costs, and it has not been an easy journey for many of these newcomers, even if they were not refugees and chose to make the journey to come to Canada to improve their lives. Regardless of how people come to communities, however, and regardless of whether or not they actually have formal supports available, one of the first things they do is generally reach out to anyone in that community who might share their same cultural background or come from the same place of origin. And there's this perception that since people who share a similar background are more or less in the same boat, they will be more empathetic and more willing to provide support. And I can certainly provide some evidence that this is the case from my study with relative strangers reaching out to new arrivals to provide housing and to help people meet their basic needs and to help them land softly, so to speak, in the new community. So this is very significant. Even just a small number of people can make a big difference. Of course, in a larger city, it's more common for newcomers to contact official organizations that might cater to people from their background. But in the case of smaller communities, it's more informal networks that play a role. Somebody might know someone who knows someone who's settled in the community. And perhaps something that's quite different from the experience of, say, the Irish migrants we were talking about earlier is, of course, the role of technology in this process. So many newcomers will actually use Facebook before they arrive in a place to identify people who might share their background in the community, and that those contacts can play an important role in helping them get established. Another thing I want to say about technology is the significance of WhatsApp groups, which, based on my research, play a really important role in a number of migrant communities. They're often used to share information. People use them to find rides or offer rides, especially in cities where transportation services might be limited, and they're also used to organize social activities. Although cultural communities tend to be much smaller, to say the least, in smaller communities when compared to larger cities, one interesting finding from my research has been that these communities tend to be very tight-knit, which may have some drawbacks, but it also has many benefits, particularly when people first arrive in the community. It's a lot harder to be anonymous in a smaller city, so if you are somebody with a particular background, that's generally known to the rest of the community of people who share that background, and they really come together to provide support to everybody in that community. So again, if I look at WhatsApp, this is often used by, say, Brazilians, who are a relatively small but growing community in North Bay that I encountered. They use WhatsApp to basically help all newcomers from Brazil get settled in the community. So they have a bit of a routine. As long as somebody ends up in that WhatsApp group, maybe through, like I said, contacting, reaching out to people on Facebook, then they get added to the group, then they have support for moving, for finding housing, everything like that right on arrival. It can help them find employment, so extremely valuable. One of the major challenges for newcomers moving to smaller communities that is perhaps a bit harder to overcome than some of these basic needs is homesickness. Beyond meeting their housing needs, their employment needs, many newcomers long for the food, the cultural events, and the traditions of the places that they've left behind. And in the absence of a critical mass of people who share their cultural background or who come from the same place of origin, it's often hard to meet these needs, as there's insufficient businesses and organizations catering to them. So what I've observed through my research is that, and Michelle can attest to this too, because we previously worked together, as she mentioned, and we did some research in Southern Ontario, and it was exactly the same. What people generally do in the beginning is travel to larger centers, do all their shopping, participate in cultural events and so on, and then go back to the smaller community where they may not have daily access to those sorts of things. With time, however, as communities grow, cultural communities grow, it becomes easier, of course, to maintain cultural organizations, and there's often an increasing formalization of different religious communities, cultural communities, and so on. And for this, I'd like to highlight the Karen community. So the Karen people are a refugee community from Burma, and they've settled in Thunder Bay in quite large numbers over several decades now. And I think their story is really interesting because they came initially to Canada through private sponsorship, through a church in Thunder Bay, and over time, 20, 30 years, they were able to grow their community to the point where they could actually buy the church. So they bought the church, and then they had the church not only for religious purposes, but they integrated their cultural needs into the church as well. So they started offering a range of cultural activities at the church that they previously had only in the privacy of their own home. So it became a community space, not just a religious space, but a community space. And the church, or the church community that sold this space to them was more than happy to do this. They saw this as a success. You know, they have a very good relationship, and they saw this as a positive move forward. So it wasn't about separating from the larger religious community, it was just that they had reached this critical mass and they were able to integrate more of their needs into that space. The Karen community also now owns a number of restaurants in Thunder Bay. They're doing really well in sports, And because of all of this, they're able to sponsor themselves even more people, more Karen refugees over from refugee camps in Thailand, which has only served to rejuvenate the community, and it's reinforced their sense of cultural identity, which has been quite positive for them. They're actually now attracting Karen refugees even from other parts of Canada who want to move to Thunder Bay to be part of this very successful and well-established diasporic community. And the final thing I want to talk about is how newcomer communities are contributing to and shaping the broader communities in which they're settling, because integration isn't just one way, right? It's not just about newcomers gradually becoming part of the societies they move to, it's in the way they enrich them. The large number of Finnish and Italian migrants who settled in Northern Ontario and in Thunder Bay in particular over the years is really evident in the landscape today. I don't know how many of you have been to that part of Ontario, but one can see shops and restaurants catering to Finnish and Italian culture, and it's just how it is now. I was told that in the past, the Italian community in particular used to have very large cultural festivals, which drew the entire broader population of Thunder Bay in, as people were interested in attending the festivals and learning more about Italian culture and traditions, but it would seem that with subsequent generations of Italian migrants, interest in this has waned, and now it's just Italian culture is considered fairly mainstream, and it's permanently etched into the culture and identity of Thunder Bay as a whole. Today, however, South Asian and particularly Indian cultural traditions and festivals have taken center stage in the city, drawing large numbers of participants who are coming to learn about food, music, and customs from a place with which they were previously very unfamiliar. Recently, an Indian festival was actually hosted inside the Italian Cultural Center, which I found very interesting because it really speaks to how subsequent waves of migrants have similar needs and have gone through similar phases of integration into the wider community. As the city of Thunder Bay has come to learn more and more about Indian migrants and their cultural traditions and their needs and experiences, the city has also better understood how they can actually help these newcomers to feel at home. And perhaps one of the best examples of this was the recent introduction of a cricket pitch in Thunder Bay, where Indian newcomers could go and enjoy really something that was for many of them a beloved sport that they missed a lot. However, interestingly, the pitch has also attracted a lot of other newcomer communities that maybe don't have the same visibility but are similarly interested in cricket. And it's also served as a space for, let's say, long-established Thunder Bay residents to come and learn about a new sport. And some of them have really gotten involved in that and have come to learn about it. So really the cricket pitch is now a place that brings people from diverse backgrounds together in a way that wasn't possible before. So I see that as a very positive change. So to conclude, I believe it's extremely valuable to have this historical perspective when considering how newcomers experience places, including or perhaps especially smaller communities. While circumstances clearly differ over time, as we've seen, there are also clear and striking similarities between the experiences of newcomers who arrived yesterday and those who arrived even 200 years ago. They face many challenges, but they've also found ways to overcome them. And I think this continuity, this shared experience, really speaks to our shared humanity and could serve as a powerful reminder of the need for empathy and understanding as we welcome newcomers into our communities, regardless of their size. As we consider how to build stronger, more vibrant communities, I think it's crucial to recognize the role of formal services in supporting newcomers, absolutely, particularly during the early stages of settlement when newcomers are at the highest risk of, let's say, falling through the cracks and not having their needs met. But equally important is understanding the cultural and social needs of newcomers, as Abigayle mentioned, and the deep desire they have to participate fully in the societies they now call home. While smaller communities may sometimes seem like unlikely destinations for newcomers, I believe the research that I presented today, as well as what the other presenters have talked about today, tells a very different story. Across Canada, smaller communities have been shaped by successive waves of immigration, and this pattern will undoubtedly continue. Recognizing this reality and fostering inclusive, welcoming environments that celebrate diverse perspectives and identities will help us to build stronger and more resilient and more vibrant communities for everyone who calls them home. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to all our panelists. Very insightful and very thought-provoking comments. And I've offered to kind of help moderate maybe some comments following the presentations. And I do believe a couple of themes have emerged from all four presentations. One that's critical is the level of support provided to newcomers, whether it's in 2025 or 1825. Very important, and it comes in many different forms, but an essential component to success. The other theme that struck me, and I hadn't thought about it as much, is the importance of community. While it's critical that newcomers, immigrants have the material support for services and housing and job prospects so they can feed their families, the importance of culture, of finding kindred spirits so they can share something as basic as traditional foods or traditional sports like cricket. And it got me thinking about the experience of the Irish in 1825, when the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada came to Peterborough in the winter of 1825-26 to check out the settlement and just see how this experiment in immigration policy was working. The Irish settlers delegated a spokesperson to speak to the Lieutenant Governor, and they were very grateful for the support the government had provided, the new opportunities they had. But there were two things they wanted from the government. One, they wanted a priest. So the opportunity to retain and to practice a religion, a cultural determinant, was very important. They left the other requirements open, saying in future we may have other needs, so we're not closing the door. But as it turned out, the community aspect was very important. The number of families that intermarried, either living next door or they met on board the ship and formed those kind of partnerships and relationships that led to weddings. And I think there were a few people in the audience that could speak to the number of, Maureen is a good example, the number of cousins and relatives she has that stem from 3 or 4 families that have intermarried. So the strength of community to support you, to help preserve those important aspects of your culture. In the case of the Irish in 1825, one thing that struck me was there is a documented recording of a St. Patrick's Day parade in 1840, in which they tied banners around poles, paraded down George Street, playing music. So music is another important. So retaining those cultural traditions and experiences was also an important factor in the success of the communities. And in the case of the Irish, that culture is just as vibrant and present today as it was 200 years ago. On the other hand, it also presented challenges, because in the 1860s, when the Irish community wanted to have a St. Patrick's Day parade, there were some Irish from around the Cavan area who didn't want to see a Catholic parade down George Street and mounted a small brass cannon around George and Sherbrooke and dared the Irish to march down the street. The mayor, in his wisdom, thought rather than encouraging a confrontation, canceled the Irish parade. So while traditions carry on and they're important, there are some traditions that can pose a challenge for how communities can leave some of the arguments from the old world behind and integrate into a new and different relationship. Well, just a couple of observations from what the Irish of 1825 experienced in terms of support, so much from government important, but also from their community as a whole. Abigayle, some thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'm going to go with the community thing. I was amazed at how important the WhatsApp group chats are and how much support that brings to immigrants. So I thought that was a really interesting point that you brought up, Melissa. But yeah, I think it just goes to show how important community is now and then, and we focus more in our paper on institutional support and how that has changed, and how that's more continuing in modern immigration compared to the immigration in 1825. But I think it's interesting to see how institutional support has changed, but that community piece, where that is one of the more defining factors of the success of immigrants, I think that's probably one of the most important things to remember.
Your story at the end, reminded me of another important aspect of the immigration experience, which it sounds like hasn't changed that much in 200 years, which is experiences of discrimination and racism, towards the newcomer population from established residents. That's something that, in addition to various other challenges, and regardless of official policies and pronouncements by public leaders, is a reality that folks continue to face. We hear it anecdotally all the time in our work and in the research. One project that Michelle does is a survey of immigrant needs every 2 years, and one of the questions in that survey is about experiences of discrimination in our community. And shockingly, although again from our perspective not surprisingly, about a third of people said that they had experienced some form of discrimination in the previous year, which was actually an increase from the survey that we did 4 years ago. And I would emphasize that in the previous year, if you were to ask, like, in your time in Canada, have you, like, I would imagine that would be close to 100%. And those experiences vary from, unfortunately, things like the canon, that we have had actual physical violence on on the basis of race or religion or identity of some form happen in Peterborough. That does happen periodically in Peterborough to this day. On a range from that to hate speech, verbal slurs being yelled out a car window as you drive down the street. I've observed that on multiple occasions. To experiences of every day being told, like, oh, wow, you speak English really great, or where do you come from? Which, might sound like a nice friendly thing to say, but when you're a newcomer who hears that every day, it's like, oh my gosh, again, and it erodes your sense of belonging and, like, this is a place where you can be without feeling like you're different. So that is a through line, if you will, of immigration from 200 years ago or today. And interestingly, who was the group that was discriminated against back in the day? It was the Irish Catholics. And whether it was Peterborough or other major cities in North America, it was certainly a point in time in our history that the Irish Catholics were unwelcome and get the hell out of here. We don't want anything to do with you. And that's true of other immigrant groups, immigrant waves in other parts of the country as well. So sadly, it seems to be part of human nature as well that continues to be the case. And highlights the importance of events like this in the work. Certainly a big part of our work at the New Canadian Centre is broadening people's perspective, number one, but also creating opportunities that are positive community experiences, so that people have that foundation to say, yes, that bad thing happened, but I know that there's all these other folks over here who want me to be here, or I know that there's this cultural community that I'm, this expatriate community or diaspora community that I'm a part of, that makes me more resilient to those negative instances. If you have anything to add on this, you're welcome to jump in. Or if we have questions from the audience too, I think that would be good.
Can Melissa hear, or do you have anything to add, Melissa?
Sorry, I'm just having some trouble hearing, so it's...
Okay, and you're closer, just
sure. Just wondering if you had anything to add, or we might go to the audience for questions.
Oh, that's okay. You can go to the audience. Thank you.
Yes. After you say your question, I might repeat it to Melissa. She might not be able to hear. Okay.
I'm an Irish language activist, teacher, and one of the things I wondered when I moved to Peterborough 3 years ago was how many of the settlers who came in the Robinson settlement were native Irish speakers or exclusive Irish speakers. So we know that up until the Great Hunger of the 1840s, the majority of Irish people still spoke Irish. And it wasn't until after that period that the language declined. And also we know that there are certain geographic areas called Gaeltacht regions where Irish is still spoken today. And of course in 1825 those areas would have been bigger. And Cork is one of those areas. So I was wondering if there's any information that we might know about the Irish language and the settlers. And to what extent was it a barrier for them to be able to communicate with an English-speaking country? And also, when it came to education of the settlers, were there any provisions for allowing the language to be taught in the schools, or was it too bad you're in Canada now, speak English? Kind of like what was happening in Ireland. So the other thing I'll say is, the other question I have is, if you look at Peterborough today, and you see how many people, I taught a couple of classes in Peterborough, Irish language classes, and I learned about people who know that they are descendants of the 1825 settlers. And the extent of even though people are dispersed around the region, there still is a very vital Irish cultural community here, including the parade, but all kinds of other things too. And I didn't really know that about Peterborough until I came here. But one thing that's absent is the language and the sport, the Gaelic sports. In Toronto, for example, where I'm from, there's a bigger language community, there's Gaelic Athletic Association clubs, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. And I was thinking about it, Melissa, when you were talking about the cricket pitches that were up in, I think, Thunder Bay. And I was thinking, well, how come there's no Gaelic Athletic Association pitches here in Peterborough? Like, to what, and when you were talking about the Canadian government said, what can we help you with? Well, we want a priest. And I was thinking, maybe before you told your answer, I was thinking, did they ask for some language or Gaelic sports supports? We want a Gaelic football pitch, or we want a hurling pitch, or something like that. Sorry for taking so long.
Just to respond, first of all, the language question is a really interesting one. I go back to my student days at Trent. We were commenting amongst the panelists here, the connections with Trent University. It's really quite striking. We all have very fond experiences there that really were influential on our careers. But the one of the things I remember from my university days at Trent was the importance of a book by Eli Kaduri. It was from Bruce Hodgins' history course, and it was the importance of language for self-expression. French Canadians speak and have a different terminology to describe experiences, as with other cultures. So you can't simply take Gaelic and find an English equivalent. You're missing the essence of the idea that's trying to be expressed. So language is an important cultural determinant, and it's important for retaining a sense of identity. And unfortunately, I don't know how many of the Irish that came over, of the 300 and some odd families, how many were Gaelic speaking only, how many of them could speak English. I suspect there would have been a fair bit of English, but I don't know. It's another important cultural determinant, and it'd be fun to see a hurling match here as part of our Bicentennial activities. But I suspect the pioneers were so busy cutting down trees and getting that first crop in to survive. The only sport was getting the eggs out of the hen house and digging the potatoes out of the ground for the first crop. So I suspect sports probably came as a second generation. We actually had some leisure time and we're just basically scraping by with an existence. But that's just my thoughts. I don't know in terms of your experience, Andy, with language, how important it is to both retain it, but also to adapt to the new reality.
Yeah, I mean, 100% language is the biggest determinant of successful settlement in Canada. And, you know, for folks, it's one of the biggest challenges for folks who come as refugees. Some can speak English or French, but many can't, you know, and again, that speaks to the journey of a refugee where they didn't intend to come to Canada. It wasn't part of their plan, so they weren't, you know, learning English in anticipation of an eventual immigration to an English-speaking country. You know, that's a huge barrier, and that's something that I think really drives the multi-generational settlement journey, and especially for those folks who come as refugees, where the parents are, you know, say in their 40s or 50s, kids are in their teens. It's the kids who learn English faster and actually become the breadwinners, and in many cases, unfortunately, interpreters in the life for the parents, and actually drive the economic survival of the parents, which is a super complicated and interesting and challenging change in what would be a typical family dynamic where, you know, imagine it changes the power dynamic within a family where the parents are relying on a teenage or you know, adolescent youth for their family's needs, you know, to help them understand what's going on, and then you bring in the income. So, you know, very challenging. But I think interestingly, as a community, one challenge that we're seeing is that we are, say, on a journey as a community of understanding what it's like to have English speakers of varying backgrounds and abilities here speaking English. And you might be wondering, what the heck did that sentence just mean? There's different ways to speak English. I speak English like someone who was born in Peterborough with English as my first language. There's people who speak English and speak another language. They might speak English fluently in addition to the native language, but the English they speak because it's an additional language or because of where they learned it, maybe in Nigeria, maybe in India. It sounds different from my English. But they might actually, you know, think about what is the purpose of language? It's to communicate an idea, to be able to understand another human being. And they may be able to do that from their perspective perfectly well in the English language. But people in Peterborough are not used to interacting with someone speaking English that isn't the English of someone who's born and raised in Peterborough. And we have found that is a real barrier for particularly the labor market and workplace success of recent immigrants. And there was a study done, I think about a decade ago, by some folks working at Fleming. They surveyed local employers and they surveyed recent immigrants, and they said, you know, employers, what's the biggest challenge you face in attracting and retaining immigrant employees? And they said, English language ability. They don't speak English well enough. They can't, you know, get ahead, or we're nervous about health and safety, being able to communicate instructions. Surveyed the newcomers, and they said, my employer doesn't understand that I can speak English fine to get by in the workplace, and they're just discriminating against me and not treating me fairly. Oh wow, that's two different experiences of the same workplace. And that dynamic is still happening in our community. And I think, you know, my personal opinion on it would be that those employers and those places in the community that can understand that reality and adapt to it fastest will have a competitive advantage and will be the ones that succeed most in our community. You know, because you think about the demographics and newcomers, people who speak English in a variety of different ways are increasingly the labor market, they're the customer base, they're the business succession, and that's the reality of Canadian society increasingly as we rely more on immigration and more on immigration from diverse parts of the world.
Thank you very much to the panelists, by the way. I was really impressed by how the emphasis on comparative migration, comparative immigration, was the theme that is chosen. It is really a critical way of getting at what is a very common experience. There is this lovely romantic notion that people are rooted in where they are born, and that that's where culture is established and remains. But the fact of the matter is, most people move from where they are born, and a few people stay, and that's why you have names from the original founders still around in an area. But if you add up the ones who stayed and compare them to the number of those who left, there's no comparison. The ones who left have found their way elsewhere. So migration is a very, very common experience among people. And it's the nuances, some of which you're getting at here, that I find really most interesting. And among the nuances, for example, the topic we just spoke of lastly, language and the importance of language and how quickly do people adapt, or how must they adapt to language, certainly would vary depending upon geography, depending upon chronology, time. An Irish migrant in the early 19th century coming to Canada was expected to be a farmer, mostly. That's really what it was all about. And in the farming community, you didn't really need language so much to integrate yourself into the local economy or the other community. You have more time to make that adaptation. Whereas nowadays, migrants coming to Canada aren't going to be put on a farm somewhere and provide for themselves by farming in somewhat isolation. They will have to take on a much more specialized job somewhere in the economy. And that seems to put a higher pressure upon learning the language very quickly. It's a very different kind of circumstance. That's the kind of comparison, I think, that's useful to think about the importance of language and why today it may be far more important than it was in the early 19th century. In the early 19th century, religion was far more important than language, and could get you into more trouble or establish yourself with greater friendships than the fact that you spoke the language or couldn't speak the language very well. So I really like the comparative approach to migration, and there are a number of other areas I think that could be explored here. The nuances are what are really interesting.
Thank you very much, Dale, for that observation. And as Michelle said at the beginning, one of the really significant components of the story that unfortunately, due to the short time frame we had to set this up, was the partnership, the association, the relationship between the Irish settlement here in 1825 and First Nations. And language may have been an issue there, but First Nations and the Irish shared, in many ways, a common heritage, pressure on land, being forced off your land, being denied your religion back in Ireland, very little prospect for future growth. So it's interesting to speculate on that first couple of years, how those Irish pioneers managed to survive the first winter. How do you hunt in 2 feet of snow? Didn't have a lot of snow in Cork. How do you fish for ice through the ice without falling through and drowning? How do you know which plants are going to help heal cuts or burns? Or how do you deal with mosquitoes? What happens in the spring when all that sap's running in the trees? I have it on good authority there was not a lot of maple trees being tapped in Cork. And yet the Irish in their first year here produced several 100 pounds of maple sugar. So where do they learn those skills? So one aspect of that, getting settled in relationships within the community, we have a hard time exploring because the documentation is so limited. We have a few things, but I'm hoping, as Michelle mentioned, the panel discussion later in August will help us explore it. But above all, we've been very conscious as a board in planning the events to mark it as a commemoration, because celebrating having to leave your country, all you know, and travel to a new world where you don't know what to expect is not always a cause for celebration. The survival and the enduring legacy certainly is, and that's what we're doing. But we've also been mindful of bearing in mind the impact it had on First Nations, something that wasn't done during the celebrations in 1875 or even through the 19th century. So I think it's part of our own education and learning about this whole immigration experience, not only for those who are coming, but the impact on those who are here and how the two communities learn to get along.
If I may just ask one last question to wrap up the panel, as we're reaching the hour-and-a-half mark, and please feel free to speak with the panelists after if you have some burning questions that you'd like to ask them. Maybe the last question I'd ask, because this panel is also opening up a dialogue on what is needed for successful immigration and for thriving communities. What is the call to action that you would encourage people to do to support immigration and immigrants today, whether from the past or from recent lessons? And maybe I'll pass it on to Melissa, who's been listening to us, to answer first. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm afraid the audience might think that you paid me to say this, but I really do think that the work that you are doing is so essential. The local immigration partnerships are, in my opinion, doing what exactly needs to be done, coordinating across sectors, tackling the issue by way of a multi-pronged approach that considers all the different dimensions. So I would say the government should be providing much more in the way of resources to organizations like yours, and it should be ramped up, because that's, I think, the best way forward.
Agreed, more funding for organizations like that. But yeah, I think also reinforcing in conversations that folks like you have, and that and statements that leaders make, that immigration isn't about immigrants taking from the public, from us. It's about an essential aspect of how we are here at all as a country and as a society, and really in many ways the benefits that folks who are here are getting because of immigration, economically, but also in terms of the richness of a multicultural society. Just changing that narrative and reinforcing that that's actually the real story that's going on, not about who's getting more or taking what.
I think I would have to say for the average person, education. Like, a lot of people don't know what the actual immigration process looks like. What are the supports that are the most important to them? What are their struggles? Like, if people don't know how these processes work, if they don't understand them, then they can't really help, or they can't advocate for more funding, more services, etc. So I think just education and asking people to educate themselves and seek those out, whether it's like attending a panel like this today or going on the government website to look at how the immigration process actually works. I think that would be probably the most important step anybody could take to help make this process better, I guess. Yeah.
I think I would certainly echo education. Andy's comments were a telling reminder the important economic role that immigrants provide for our economy. Everyone, the notion that somehow we're giving and not getting is probably a good starting point. This is an investment in all of our future. But on a different level altogether, there's a time that we're in where peoples and groups are reverting back to tribalism. There's less tolerance for the other. There's less, how to put it, willingness to engage with somebody who's different, someone who different race, different skin, different language. And instead of embracing the diversity and the challenge of learning something new, it's a counter-reaction to reject, to dislike the other. And I'm not sure in a local sense, in a national sense, in a global sense, how we combat that, but boy, it's really needed for sure. I mean, you look around the world and you see the hardships. If immigration was ever an ongoing need, it certainly is today, the conflicts and the turmoil in the world, we should be opening our doors, not closing.
Okay, one last I'd like to thank you again for sharing all of your knowledge and your comments today, and for all of you to attend. It was a long way coming for this panel with a lot of community partnerships and meetings and discussions, so really happy to have you here today. There's still a lot of food at the back, so please feel free to take them as you go your way out. I do have some gifts from the panelists, and Melissa, I'll have to coordinate a time to give yours, but it's just a small token of our appreciation, and I think your names are on there. Okay, thank you so much, everyone.